Today we're working on part 3, and we have this one homework due tonight, so don't forget about that guy. Okay, so what did we do last time? Last time we were working on parts 1 and 2, which were questions all about the month of December in 2014 of the stock price, and we were essentially just buying some shares at the beginning of the month and then seeing how much the valuation changed by the end. So let's go over 1 or 2 of these really quick. Let's say we start with this guy where we have 100 shares. Well, first thing we need to do is figure out what the value of this investment is at the beginning of the month. So we look at the close price on the purchase date, and that would then imply that the valuation of our investment initially is that since we have 100 things, each worth $326, we multiply those together and get how much we spent, which is the value of our investment at that point. However, by the end of the month, we see that the close price has dropped down a little bit. And so now in order to compute the value, we still have 100 things, but now they're each worth slightly less. So we multiply 100 by that amount again. We get this number. And then to finish it off, we are then comparing these two values. We subtract them to see that we lost roughly $1,500. And we solve for the percent change between them by using that formula from the previous module, which is new minus old over old, to see that there's roughly a 5% decrease in our value. Now, the very next question adds a step to this process. They don't tell us how many shares we own. They tell us how much cash we're starting with. I want to show you something really quick in my notes to help solve this problem. So when we are figuring out how much we spent on this investment initially, the first thing we have to do is actually figure out how many shares we can afford. So start just like the previous question, figure out how much one share is worth. Then in order to figure out how much we can afford, we essentially figure out how many times 326 goes into 5,000 by dividing. Okay, simple enough. But this is 15.3, and the notes specifically say we can't have fractional shares. Now, even if this was 15.9, we're always going to round down because they're not going to give us any chunk of a share for free. So we round that down to 15. And finally, to figure out how much we actually spent, which is the initial value of our investment, we say, okay, I bought 15 things at a price of $326 each. So we multiply to get this amount. And this amount that we spent is always slightly less than the amount of cash we started with. Technically, they could be equal, but that's unlikely. Now, I want to show you something. Say we take these two cells, and I use that arrow button to sort of visually round. That does not change the value of the number. Look what happens if I try to say, oh, I own 15 things at $326 each. It gives me the wrong amount because Excel still remembers that 0.33 that's sitting, or 0.337 that's sitting inside that cell. So it's not good enough to just use this arrow. You have to either manually type 15 somewhere, or I'm going to show you a new way to do it right now. The new way, which is using a function, uses one of these three guys over here. And specifically, we're going to use the round down function. And the way it works is there are two inputs. The first one is the number you're going to round. And the second one is how many digits you want to round to after the decimal place. Since I want to round to a whole number, I'm going to round it to 0 digits after the decimal place. And then we get exactly 15. Well, why is this useful? I can round that in my head. Well, the whole point of these calculators, right, is I just want to change this one number at the top and have everything else instantly calculate. And I can't do that if I'm having to manually round something in the middle of this process. So here's one more trick you can use. You could also skip this step here. Instead of computing this and then rounding this cell, what you can do is you can put the division inside of round down. And so it does the division first. It computes that 15.33 whatever, and it rounds that down. there's exactly 15, and now I can change this to whatever I want. This changes appropriately, which is really nice. So let's go back to the
So if
actual
you were to
problem.
do like
Oh, go ahead.
after like that comma, there was like that 0, and
Yeah.
that's the number of digits like after the
So if I
decimal.
did comma 1, it'd say 15.3,
Okay,
exactly 15.3.
cool.
Right, exactly.
Thank you.
Okay, so we use that round down function here because it automates this process for us. And then the rest of the problem is stuff we've already talked about, right? How much did you spend? That's number of shares you own times the price. That the amount you spent is the initial value of your investment. The future value of your investment is those 15 things times the future price each. And then we have the same subtraction, same new minus old over old to finish it out. Now, let's do one more question before we go to these notes, because it's quite a bit of stuff I want to look at there. There is a question at the end of the part 1 questions that says, you decrease a number by 10%. What do you have to increase it by to get back to where you started? Now, this is tricky because they don't actually give you any numbers to play with. Well, here's a trick you can use. Just pick a number. You'll get the same answer regardless of what number you pick. So I picked 100 because that's basically the easiest number you can pick when you're doing math involving percentages. So the question now, knowing we are starting with 100, is what happens if you take 100, you shrink it by 10%? Well, we use this formula over here, or you can do this in your head because it's 100, to get 90. Now, the question is actually asking us, if I start at 90, what percent do I have to increase 90 by to get back to 100? This is kind of showing you a weird property of percentages. It's not 10%. Even though I decreased by 10%, I'm going to have to increase by more than that to get back to what I started with. And the reason why is 10% of 90 is only 9. That's not enough to get us back to 100. So how do I figure this out? If I know I'm going to start at 90 and I know I'm going to end at 100, what's the percent that goes from one to the other? That's this formula. This is the formula that solves for percentages. And so we can just take the new value, 100, because I'm moving back to 100, minus the old value, 90, all over 90, to get this guy over here and see that, oh, I have to increase by slightly more than 10%, 11% to get back to where I started with. And there's some similar stuff with that question as well. So that was part 1. I know it was a little quick, but we can come back to this if you like. Now I want to go through the rest of my notes so you can get started on the new stuff happening today. Okay, so what else? When you start part 3, you have, this is some data I just made up, but essentially you have all this data. You got like 5,000 rows. I can actually just show you. And next to these 5,000 rows, you're going to have to build 4, I believe, new columns. And so you're going to start by doing a formula up here and then dragging it down. But this is super annoying. Let's look how long this is taking. I'm not even halfway there yet. So how's this actually going to work efficiently? Well, let's say we have this data instead. And I build a new column. The column happens to be the average between these two numbers, and I want to drag this down quickly. Well, instead of manually dragging it down, which works, if you hover over the bottom right corner and double click, it assumes you would like to drag it so that it's as tall as this column immediately to its left. And that's really nice when you have to drag for like 100 pages. Now here's one more trick that has to do with double clicking. Let's say I go over here and I double click. I don't know if you can hear my mouse, but nothing's happening. The reason nothing is happening is because there's nothing right here. This column that I'm using this double click trick has to be touching something, and then it'll know, oh, you mean to match this guy immediately to my left, because before there was nothing immediately to its left and it didn't know what to do. So use that double click trick when you need to drag really far. It's much faster. Next trick I want to show you is, okay, what if you have all this data here and you as you're scrolling down, you forget which column you're in? It'd be nice if this happened. Watch what happens when I drag. Notice, see how my column headers are staying there? It'd be nice if that happened. I don't actually like this, but some people do, and I want to show you how to do this. So what we're going to do is go over to the View tab I'm gonna undo what I've done for you already. Go to this freeze pane tab and click unfreeze. Now when I scroll down, this is the default behavior, right? The columns aren't freezing. How do we do that? Well, if I put my cursor here on this Monday and hit freeze, it freezes everything above it. However, another thing you can do if you're interested, let's say I put my cursor on this green guy and hit freeze. Not only does it freeze above it, it freezes everything left of it, just in case you want to freeze things over there as well. So utilize this freeze button, check it out if you want those column headers to stay put as you go up and down. I don't like it because it causes some weird things to, other things to happen. It's just a personal preference thing. So try it out, see if you like it. Next thing is a new function that is extremely useful. So today, when you get into part 3, you're going to have like 5,000 dates, and the questions are going to be like, okay, what's this number next to this specific date? And you're going to have to scroll until you find the appropriate date down here, which is really annoying. I want to show you a function that does that for you. And this function is called XLOOKUP. And if you downloaded Excel anytime in the last couple months or updated in the last couple months, you should have this function. And if you haven't, you might not. And I can show you a couple ways to fix that later. But assuming you have that, the way this function works is that we have to put in 3 different things inside the function. The lookup value is the thing you know. This would be the thing the question tells you to find. So like, hey, find the number next to January 16th, and then you know, with your eyes, go find January 16th. So the lookup value is the thing you know. The lookup array is the column where it lives. So you're telling Excel where to look for it. And then the return array is the column where the answer lives. So like if I wanted to know the low price, or sorry, these are temperatures, the low temperature next to this date. So it would look like this. I've typed a couple examples here for you. Let's say I'm looking up the low temperature on this date. I type that date out, and question in chat, I'll get to you in a second. We reference that as our lookup value. So there is that. And then I say, where do I find it? Well, I would select all these red cells here. And then I say, what do I want next to it? I select all these purple cells here. And it just tells me there's the number. Now, technically, there's an even easier way to do it. Like when I did this initially, whoops, that's not what I just typed. Click this. I use the whole Control-Shift thing to select these guys, Control-Shift things, select those guys, and that works. But here's an even easier way. After you get to this second and third section, you can just click this letter at the top of the screen, and it selects the entire column. Comma, letter, entire column. It's done. You don't have to do any Control-Shift stuff, which is really nice. And if you look at the code, you'll notice there's no rows because it's literally doing the entire column. So the only way this would be a bad idea is if, let's say, I had some random data up here above. Well, when you select the entire column, it's going to look at that random data and potentially find the answer there instead. So don't do that if you have data above or below your data set. But you shouldn't anyway. This is really only used when you have massive sets of data. You shouldn't put anything above it or below it anyway. Okay, follow-up question. Why, or can you just use Control F to find it? You absolutely can, but here's the difference. Let's say I want to look up another number, 5, 27, 14, and I just hit enter. See what just happens? It spit it out for me. I didn't have to go down there, look for the number, and then manually type it in. Whenever you manually do something, you are leaving yourself open to mistakes. Like if I accidentally would have typed 20.54, whole question's wrong. You know, you want something like, where's my silly notes? You want something like this, where I can change this date whenever I want, and everything updates. I don't want to have to manually type in anything else. I want the functions to automatically do this for me. That is the benefit of using functions. So yes, You can manually look for it with your eyes. You can manually use Control F. I'm not going to stop you, but XLOOKUP is quicker and it's safer because you're going to make less mistakes if you learn this function. Okay, let's do another example. Let's say I want to find the biggest value in this column C. So I don't even know what this is. This is not a lookup function. I just want to know what is the biggest number here. So this is actually a brand new function. It's called max. Oops, that's not how you type that. Oh my God. And the way this works is very simple. Just highlight a column, hit enter. That's the biggest number in the column. That's all there is to it. There's also a function called min that will tell you the smallest number in a column. Okay, why did I need to do that? Well, there's going to be questions in the workbook that say things like this. Find the date next to the biggest number in this column. Well, this is a lookup question, but you have to tell Excel what that biggest number is first. So first you run max so that you know what the biggest number is. And now I don't want to have to scroll for 74.19. I don't want to have to use Control F. So I'm going to use an XLOOKUP function. I'm going to say, hey, Excel, find me this guy. That guy lives in C. The answer I want lives in B. I hit enter. That is actually the correct answer, the correct date, but it looks really weird. What's happening here? Well, the way Excel stores dates is just as a single number, and then it's up to us to reformat that. So what we do is we click on this cell, and then on the Home tab, we have this drop-down box at the top that says General. We just change that to a date, and there we go. That's the actual number I was looking for. And so now this automatically found the date that was next to this guy right here, which is really nice. Question in chat about where can you find this recording? They're all in the same spot. They're all on that YouTube page I emailed out. If you don't have that email anymore, just send me an email. I'll respond to it. Okay, last function we need to learn today. Count and COUNTIF, kind of the same function. It's just one expands on the other. So first function, very simple. Let's say I want to know how many numbers are in this column here. If I type count, select this column, it tells me there's 995 numbers. I don't have to scroll all the way down here and say, oh, it goes to 999, but then I have to subtract these 4 rows because there weren't any numbers. It just counts automatically. It's very nice. Also notice it does not count words. So if I use it on column A, it gives me 0. So that's why I was able to do this, and it ignored these 2 things here for me, which is really nice. Okay, next example. Now, that's not actually what we're going to do. That is nice to know the total amount of numbers, but more often than not, what we're actually interested in is how many cells satisfy a certain criteria. So in other words, like how many of these cells in this column are strictly less than 46? We can't use count anymore because it counts everything. So we're going to use a different function, COUNTIFs or COUNTIF. And the way it works is you still start by utilizing a column first, but then it needs a criteria cell to explain, hey, these are the types of cells I'm looking for. So outside of this function, you always start by typing a criteria, and I've typed like the 5 most common here, where it's either strictly less than or equal to, exactly, strictly greater than, or greater than equal to, and then you just say, hey, let's do a quick COUNTIF on this column that's looking for this criteria, and it tells you exactly how many of the cells satisfy that. Really, the only more complicated example is if you want something that's like in between. You can't do this as a single criteria. So here's the trick you're going to utilize. You're going to use a COUNTIFs, and it has to be plural because we're going to have multiple criteria. And see these little floating words down here? We're going to follow this. The first thing it wants is a range, which is just a column. So I'm going to highlight all of that column. And then it wants a criteria. So I'm going to click on my first criteria. Now, normally you might think, okay, I'll just click on the second criteria now, but look at this floating tooltip down here. It always alternates between range, criteria, range, criteria. So I have to do another range C, and then I can put this second criteria, hit enter. There we go. There's 88 cells between these two. So just wanted to show you a quick example there. Last thing I wanted to point out, I think I already mentioned this, but yeah, if you don't have XLOOKUP, you can use VLOOKUP instead, or these other two functions. And there's an example of that on Canvas if you want to check that out, or I can walk through it with you. In my opinion, it's much better to use XLOOKUP. So I would work on just updating your Excel instead. But if you don't want to, I'll show you how those other things work. Next thing I want to talk about is starting today, some of these modules, like part 3 today, is going to become slightly more difficult than things we've been doing in the past. So if you've been struggling either with previous modules or are already struggling in this module, I'd strongly advise you changing your study habits or how you are spending your time in class. And the best 2 things I can really recommend doing is simply asking more questions during class or finding other people to work with and like in breakout rooms and working together, just to keep you from falling behind. And so you're not just, stuck on a question and not doing anything. Other thing I would advise doing is potentially starting the homework ahead of time. Like for example, the parts 1 and 2 homework's due tonight. Going forward from here on out, I would advise maybe starting it the day before. So even though it's due tonight, maybe you at least looked at it yesterday. And the reason why is because then you can ask me questions about it if needed during class, like quick questions, because you already looked at it. And then you can spend the rest of class working on the new material. This is just another thing that'll, hopefully prevent you from getting too far behind if you do start to fall behind. So those just a couple things I wanted to point out.